Welcome back.
Here we are at Ontological Shock.
It's Nathan.
And Seth.
You got it.
And we're continuing our discussion of
Mysticism.
And
magic.
And esotericism and all that stuff.
Any other word you can find for it. We got it right here.
Yes.
The occult.
So while we were taking our break, you were making some interesting remarks about Kepher and Malkuth.
Oh, boy. If you're ready for me spitballing a half-baked idea into a full-on...
Those are the best ideas.
...situation. A lit
Let's go
situation.
Full-on half-baked.
All right, cool. So, I mean, in the Kabbalah, Kether is the top and Malkuth is the bottom. And they're two different spheres. And they both relate to kings or royalty. And because Kether means crown and Malkuth means kingdom. And the crown is the thing that you wear. Has sort of subjective quality to it, but it's above you. It's on your head, but above. And Malkuth is the place and the setting in which you happen. But it's a kingdom, right? And there's a couple different ways to look at it. You could be like, I am in God's kingdom, because it's a God-based system. I'm in God's kingdom. But I think in actuality, Kabbalah is is kind of built to deify the individual beyond being human, and thereby it should be your kingdom. But it can't just be your kingdom normally if you're walking around with all your normal unawakened complexes and being a general suffering person in the wheel of samsara to cross systems. So you have to learn to be a sovereign and to inherit the kingdom and make it truly a kingdom. Malkuth is a kingdom, because otherwise you're living in the land of shells, the Qliphoth, the dark inverted side of the tree. Qliphoth means husk or shell. It's like something without the
imbalanced force.
It's an imbalanced force, and that's because the metaphor they're using is that it's empty. It lacks the light and the life force, which is coming from the top, from Kether, essentially. So it's the flip side of the negative side of Satanism, I guess, if we're going to go there, because it's completely material with no spiritual or mental or component to it at all. It's just the husk. The body without a person in it.
Did you ever hear Steiner's, the way he talks about Satan?
Ahriman.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. He divides the idea of Satan into two different things. On the one hand, Lucifer is that which draws humanity up into the light. Sure. And Ahriman is that which draws us down. So you could say that way that the Qliphoth, at least the way you're talking about them right now, are more of the Ahrimanic aspect of Satan.
Yeah, absolutely. Just weight with no content, empty promises. But yeah, I was trying to use it to illustrate the idea of like what does it mean to become your own sovereign and to become free of your complexes, to become a truly free person, in which you can look at the world around you as a Malkuth, as a kingdom in which you live. And I was positing the idea that the realization of the kingdom could be like the realization of the nature of emptiness in Buddhism. You realize that everything's empty here. It's a shell, an empty shell, essentially a Qliphoth. And that since nothing in this world really holds anything at all, it's just a bunch of your projections, and there's a liberation in that. You detach from them, and then you can see the true positivity of this world.
Yeah, one of the verses from the Fundamental Verses of the Middle Way by Nagarjuna that comes to mind is, "One for whom emptiness is possible, all things are possible."
Perfect.
And the way that is occurring in the logical argument of the text, it could be read as meaning that the interlocutor is charging Nagarjuna with the accusation that believing in emptiness makes it impossible to believe in causality, etc., etc. But it could also be read as saying that having realized emptiness, it is the ordinary limitations on experience, and thus reality, and as much as reality is just the sum of experience, is sort of unlocked.
Absolutely.
So, Becoming God. When you talk about becoming God, you mentioned overcoming personal complexes. Would you say that, in a sense, to achieve this divine potential of consciousness is sort of the same as overcoming the sum of all your personal complexes? Well, maybe so. Maybe that's the same as overcoming karma. And the way they say a Buddha doesn't have karma.
Polishing the telescope, right? Your lens is covered. You have to clean it off so you can see the truth, because it is your own karmic blockages or yetzeratic blockages or whatever it is. They're keeping you from seeing things as they really are, which is actually quite simple, but it's not that simple because all you're seeing is your own projections.
Explain what you mean by yetzeratic blockages.
It's just like I was just using a sort of like Kabbalistic angle to it. Yetzera is you could just say it's the astral plane, I guess, if you want to really simple about it. And that's, the plane of the mind, the plane of magic, and plane of emotions, and where all of your misunderstandings are going to occur.
Right. Didn't you say one time, the first time you did ayahuasca, you were rocketing up and down the 4 Kabbalistic worlds, being like pummeled with different realizations about the nature of emptiness?
Huh. I wonder if I did say that. I mean, I have had like a kind of recurring thing where like I'm in either drug states or weird mystical things that happen where, I don't know if this was what I was referring to there, but where I will like, my mind will just throw stuff out like aphorisms or magical symbols or whatever. And I'm like, is that what this means? Is that what this means? And then like I'll get a kind of dialogue or like certain answers, or sometimes things are just like thrown at me too. I guess that might have been what happened there. But I mean, that's one of my favorite things about using kind of established magical systems as opposed to just your own system, which you completely came up with, because things take up residence in your psyche and then become gain their own reality and relevance to you. Like if we were talking about doing the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram earlier. It's like, yeah, you get that thing and you're like, okay, well, this was made in the late 1800s by a bunch of Victorian dudes, which probably don't have very much in common with me. Like I can, drawing a pentagram, what's the point? But if you do it enough, that pentagram becomes incredibly meaningful to you. I mean, and you see it in all of these contexts relevant to your life now, pregnant and full as a symbol. And you gain a completely new personal relationship with these things. It's crazy to see them reanimated, like it's no longer a dead system from old people. It's like actually happening right now.
Yeah, I feel like over the course of the past decade or so, you've sort of shifted away from more of a chaos magic emphasis. Chaos magic being kind of like the Jeet Kune Do of magic, or the, make your own system according
to
principles.
Metaphor.
Thanks. And, into being more invested in traditional Western systems. What do you feel like inspired you to make that shift, and what do you think you've gotten out of it?
I think I'm very informed by chaos magic, and I think, the term chaos magic is a little obnoxious to me, just because it was, I use it, obviously, but it's, when I think about it, because it's a term that came out from the 70s when chaos theory was really, cutting edge, so they are tying that in. Just like when you look at NLP, it came out during when cybernetics was just really all the rage, so they're using all these cybernetic metaphors, Yeah. It's an artifact of its time, but what it actually is, which is totally free-form personal magic, is very high-level magic, and most systems are just systems for doing that. So it's kind of a master key in a sense. But because it and most of its practitioners aren't really kind of aimed towards the really deep-rooted end of spiritual stuff, like some of the crazier, in my opinion, things that exist in the Western esoteric tradition, certain forms of alchemy or sexual magic or really high-level realizations, I'm kind of moved more into things that investigate those things and have a longer pedigree of burrowing into these things and are more proven methods for people who have worked this path for longer periods of time throughout history. Right. That being said, I feel like I'm always doing chaos magic. It's just that I'm doing it in this direction at the moment.
That's an interesting point of view. All magic is chaos magic. Would you say that's like kind of a reflection of what you're saying?
Sure.
But maybe traditional magic is like intergenerational cooperative chaos magic.
Could you say that in a different way?
Well, the people who made up the rituals and symbols, they were doing chaos magic, and then other people accepted it as being the case. It's kind of like that joke that the difference between a religion and a cult is that in a cult, there's still someone alive who remembers that it was made up.
Oh. Yeah, that's pretty good.
But, that begs the question of whether or not any of the constructs in these systems have their own, I'm going to use a word that I feel is flawed, and you'll see why it's flawed when I say it, whether any of these constructs have their own intrinsic validity, or whether they represent a principle that's actually universal, or because I think that there's a spectrum between the authentically universal and the purely culturally conditioned, or even further along, the psychologically conditioned.
Yep.
A friend of mine made the joke that there's a lot of these people who develop something in their meditation experience, and they say, you have to look at this 1,000-spoked wheel that's made of all these colors, and they tell their students to have to do this because this is the key to all the secret realizations. And I think it was Pete who said this. He said, it's really more of a them thing, like a purely idiosyncratic thing,
totally.
Which happened to unlock some understanding for them.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have a skin around whatever you're doing to go that deeply in it. Just from where we are, we have to have particulars, and we work deeply in those particulars, even though they're ultimately all arbitrary. But you can't just go around like with that, thinking you have that realization, because it's just going to be your brain telling you that I know it's all arbitrary, unless you deeply go into the work in one direction or another and learn it, internalize it. And it's when you were saying that too is interesting to me because it's kind of like the idea of has God created man in His own image, or has man created God in His own image? From the modern kind of materialistic world that we are in, it makes sense to say man created God in His own image. It makes sense. But that's a very exoteric, I think, way to look at it, too. Oh, no, am I forgetting where I was going with that? Because if you look at, like, a symbol system like alchemy, right? Like, alchemy is interesting to me because it's using metaphors from the physical world. We're talking about, like, state changes or chemistry or plants or the sun or lions or birds or animals or whatever to explain spiritual states, while still holding the view that the spiritual states are primary and first, the higher planes that are then reflecting these things. So it's almost like a reverse. It's like a backronym or something. But through looking at the world that way, you kind of start zooming in on like what metaphors keep showing up culturally or across different places. Like the sun, incredibly potent human metaphor, right? Fucking every culture in the world has some kind of system of mysticism or religion focused on the sun. You cannot deny it. It's a huge one, right? Obvious. The moon, blah, 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 blah. The circle, archetypes. Right. What are archetypes? And why are these the ones that keep showing up? There's certain things that are more potent for certain reasons. And that is what kind of gives me a counter-argument to the idea that people are creating the systems in the first place. Because in a way, we are. But in a way, with some of these things, they have such relevance in our psyche before we can even think of doing a magical operation that the system is given to us in a sense.
Listening to you speak, it kind of made me reflect on the fact that with respect to magic specifically, in a way, I feel like in the past couple of years, I've kind of traced an opposite path from going from more systems focused into more chaos focused. And by that I mean going from originally studying Western ceremonial magic generally, and then more Thelema, and then getting away from that into Buddhism. And then in the past couple of years, like just being purely experimental with systems. And one of the things that I've done a lot of work with is the Lovecraft mythos.
Oh.
And, I had this thought at one point. I remember realizing, every time I open up a book of Aleister Crowley, what I'm really looking for is Lovecraft.
Ooh.
Because
Nice.
you have this reputation that's been built up of the wickedest man in the world, and you expect to find in the pages something that is just a total affront to everything sane and decent
absolutely.
and good. And that's not really what's in there.
Instead, half the time you get a strange technical manual about math, Hebrew, some plants, and what seems like religion.
Yeah, and it is a pretty wholesome point of view. It's very... It's like a kind of proto-secular humanism dressed up in a lot of very fancy mythological stuff. And
Yow. Hashtag that.
I think that maybe I won't fully agree with that statement later. Every time I try to read Crowley, there is stuff that I'm like, okay, this is a gem, and there's a lot of stuff where I'm like, I can't even begin to imagine what this means, if it even has a specific meaning. And
Totally.
I'm not willing to do the legwork to
Yeah,
find
of
out
course,
if it does.
of course. I've seen what happened to people who take that system too far.
Yeah, and there is some dark stuff in there. If you get into the 3rd chapter of the Book of the Law,
I mean, that gave him trouble. Crowley was like,
yeah,
had his own apprehensions about that.
And some people embrace that as representing how the ethics that someone who is going to live up to those principles should stand by. Other people read it differently,
Of course.
as more of a warning.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think it's kind of like Plato's Republic, too. I mean, like, you can read it and be like, okay, this is like a recipe for like a fascist government system.
Yeah.
Or you can read it by noticing that right at the beginning he states very clearly that this is a spiritual metaphor that you're supposed to be applying to yourself and your own psyche.
yeah. But getting back to the Lovecraft thing, I found it very rewarding in a sense to sort of re-engineer a magical system that was informed by exposure to global esoteric systems and to, the Theravada constructs, to the Vajrayana stuff, and to the integral frameworks, and as a kind of artistic enterprise to create a magical system just for the sake of it, just as a kind of experiment in psychology and spirituality. And I feel like doing that taught me a lot.
Yeah, it sounds very valuable.
I mean, granted, it became a bit much at points because,
What happened?
well, it started off as a joke.
As most good religions do, probably.
Yes. Well, I made the joke to my friend Stefan that it'd be really hilarious if we were to get on the train in black robes with one of those faux manuscript copies of the Necronomicon and go around proselytizing about
New York City subway.
about Yog-Sothoth. And just as a aberrant thing to do. And, we kept developing the idea, and it kept getting more and more ambitious. And we came to the point where we said, you know what, if we're going to do this, we should develop a whole cosmology, a whole metaphysics about it, a theology. And then we got to, if we're going to do that, we should inhabit it. On a day-to-day basis, we should speak as if this were our belief system, like method acting, so that when we did go out and do this performance art prank, we would be so deeply embedded in the construct that we had created that it would be that much more powerful.
Sure.
And it turned into a little bit of a mind fuck. We said that it was kind of like a Mobius strip that we were traversing between sane and insane. And what was problematic about it is that as we were making stuff up, we were finding that would be part of this Lovecraftian framework. We were finding that it was already prefigured in Lovecraft himself, or that people were doing interpretive work that was going along the same lines. And it's kind of a weird structure. We created a grade system that was based on Nagarjuna's tetralemma, so that the first grade is none of this is true, and the second grade is all of this is true.
Nice.
The third grade is you can't say that it is neither true nor not true, and of course the last one is you can't say that it is both true and not true, and stuff like that. So it was meant to be a sort of postmodern pseudo cult, which was just created as an art object.
Yeah, great. Awesome.
But one of the things we started to do
amazing.
is, you're like, well, if we're going to do that, we should actually perform magic under the auspices of this made-up thing. So now, in a way, I feel like this was to chaos magic. Maybe this is an overstatement, but in a sense, it feels like it was to chaos magic what the Abramelin operation was to, or is, to the Western Hermetic tradition.
Wow.
This was something that went on for months and so on and so forth. And to the extent that I'm willing to entertain, the constructs of the whole Western thing, because, I do have a certain skeptical distance from the occult as a whole. But in a way, it feels like the Yog-Sothoth working was sort of like an HGA experience. And by HGA, I mean Crowley uses the expression the Holy Guardian Angel, which he derives from Abramelin. And in that sort of overall vein of esoteric practice, it's said to be important to come into contact with the guardian angel, which is a way of talking about the higher self. And paradoxically, I feel like this whimsical, intentionally ironic, self-undermining exercise wound up being revelatory in some ways. Or at least providing a metaphorical vehicle to explore some metaphysical and spiritual things that might not have been clear otherwise.
Wow. That sounds amazing.
It was weird, because over the course of a couple of months, I did do ayahuasca a couple of times, and this with the gentleman who was collaborating with me, Stefan, and we did this in the darkness of the wilderness, in the Catskills, at night, and on I think every one of those occasions after we had initiated this work, the only entities that appeared were creatures of the Lovecraft pantheon. And so, I found myself surrounded by these tentacular apparitions, which were greater than space and time.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was weird.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's weird for me to try to imagine an extra-dimensional tentacle.
Well, actually, you could think of it this way. Have you ever heard Grant Morrison talk about the hyper-entity?
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, the idea is simple. Let's say that you were able to occupy a perspective from outside of time. If you were to look at the world line of yourself,
yes.
you'd see yourself and then a version of you behind yourself and behind yourself snaking in through the door, and you'd be able to see this snake of you which extends backwards in time and into your mother's womb, and so on for the world lines of all the individuals from whom you descend.
World line being a term from physics that refers to the trajectory of an object through time and space?
Yeah, exactly. So, from that point of view, all of humanity is a single kind of hyperentity. And all of life on Earth emerges from that first accidental moment where, the soup of prebiotic chemistry happened to create a replicator. So you could think in that sort of atemporal perspective of the Earth as being this single biological entity, which is, and in that sense, we are the mind of the Earth, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the tentacles, though, could be the world lines of individual things within space-time. And moreover, if there were entities that had more dimensions and they intersected with a lower plane, they could look like pulsating flesh things, because in the same way that if you put a sphere through a two-dimensional plane, first it'll be a dot, then a larger and larger circle, smaller and smaller circle, then a dot. If you
Flatland.
if you put an actual biological 4 or 5 or whatever dimensional thing into 3 space, it would look like pulsating orbs.
Yeah, for sure.
And you could develop the idea further, because people cite the parallel between neurons and the large-scale structure of the universe. They look very similar, and in fact, mathematically, they have very similar properties, even if analyzed in a very formal and rigorous way. And that looks a lot like Yog-Sothoth, and Yog-Sothoth is the mind of the universe. I even saw a lecture about panpsychism, where the lecturer was talking about how, maybe really it is more literal that the universe is a brain, and it's a mind that has a bad case of dissociative personality disorder.
Oh yeah, oh my God, that's great.
Yeah, and we did a lot of work with it. Basically, what we wound up doing was mapping it onto Ken Wilber's kind of integral holarchical structure, wherein Azathoth corresponds to physics, and Azathoth is the blind idiot god. It's dreaming the universe, but it's not experiencing the universe. That's right, that's Azathoth behind us. And Shub-Niggurath is the life world. So Shub-Niggurath is the mother of 10,000 young. Shub-Niggurath is the great goddess of the Lovecraft pantheon, and Yog-Sothoth is mind, consciousness, and each one of the levels in the holarchy transcends and includes the others. And physics does not define, predict, or explain biology. Biology does not define, predict, or explain consciousness. And Shub-Niggurath and Yog-Sothoth are kind of you could say that they're like tantric consorts.
Okay.
And so, in a sense, like life as we experience it is the perpetual copulation of Yog-Sothoth and Shub-Niggurath.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, and you could keep going, but...
Wow, that's great. The tantric consort thing is very nice. That I have no idea how I'm about to say this, but it feels very elucidating to hear you say that.
Yeah, I mean, we played around with it a lot. Like, for example, in the sense in the Heart Sutra, samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara.
Yeah.
Azathoth is Yog-Sothoth, Yog-Sothoth is Azathoth, like, and so on, and so on.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds like a wild trip.
Yeah, and it made me think that it could be a good exercise for people to create a cosmology as part of their practice. But I think it comes out much better if you
use really evil entities like you did.
Yeah, well, Yog-Sothoth is not specifically evil, but I think the further away from Earth you get, the more it's less it's a matter of being evil, and the more it's a matter of being different.
Very nice, sure.
And that's quite explicit in Through the Gates of the Silver Key. But let's bring it back to mysticism in general.
Did we ever leave?
Did we ever leave? What do you think is the relationship between, on one hand, there's magic that is for the purpose of affecting change in the world.
Yep.
And on the other hand, there's magic that's for the purpose of spiritual liberation. I feel like what tends to happen is people get interested in that sort of thing for the sake of mundane purposes.
Yeah, it's a gateway drug.
Yeah, and then you start to think, well, if I were to do some of this spiritual work, maybe I'd be more effective at the affecting the world thing.
Totally.
And then...
Yeah, no, I was actually thinking about that during the break, actually. We went to Wendy's. And there was I can think of a particular autobiographical time in my life when I went through that. And I can think of also another cool guide-like figure whose writings have kind of lent in that direction. So Paul Foster Case, who formed there's an occult group called the Builders of the Adytum. It's an esoteric order. It's kind of based on the Golden Dawn. He also authored this very introductory section to it called, I think it's called 7 Steps in Practical Occultism. It's kind of like it doesn't matter. So, very introductory thing. It's typically given out in installments. Some people, like a mail-in course or something. I came across this on the West Coast many years ago. And it culminates in you have a certain desire. You hold it in your mind, maybe before you go to sleep or a couple times a day. Very New Thought, Napoleon Hill sort of consciously creating circumstances kind of thing to do. But so that's like his kind of intro system ends in that, which is then going to dump you into this larger graded esoteric order. But so you're doing this gray magic, so to speak, magic to get things in life, get laid, get rich, get even kind of magic, whatever it is, get the thing you want. And that, by bringing that about, it should give you the dawning realization that, holy shit, this stuff works, and then set you on a path where ultimately you're going to go for the highest aim. But I remember when I was doing this, I started out, I don't even remember what the goal I was working with at the time was. Like, I want to, I don't know, get laid or something. Pretty common. Whatever it was. So I was doing that, and then after a while I was like, well, but what about a version of me what's even better than that? Like, what about a version of me that say it was getting laid, like gets laid all the time? And then that seems even better. Why don't I just go for that? Wait, what about a version of me that gets laid all the time because he's just awesome? He's just an awesome guy. He's like a better version of myself that I want to be. And then how can I not think about that? That's an even better one. And then these goals keep getting bigger until I eventually just came up with like this image of the person I wanted to be and a magical name for it. And then that became the goal I focused on. And then after a while I was like, well, this kind of sounds like a holy guardian angel type of situation.
Right.
It just keeps going. And I remember in some of Alan Chapman's books, he wrote Advanced Magic for Beginners. I don't know if he did write some other books, but mostly that one. But in his work, he talks about that too. He's like, well, just first your goal is to make your magic work. And then when it works, how do you make it better? What if your goal is just to keep going until you just become the most powerful, amazing magician possible? Eventually, if you keep doing that, you're going to end up, in theory, with a more spiritually oriented goal, which transcends the self. Obviously, This doesn't happen to everybody. Some people just become the quote-unquote black brothers who are just continually wanting just the...
Do you think that's a real thing?
Selfish goals. I mean, I think people who do a lot of magic who never transcend towards a mystical position are just still trying to do it to pay rent, and that's about it for years on end. Absolutely happens.
But aren't the Black Brothers supposed to be, a malevolent force behind like things and controlling and some dark conspiracy type thing?
I mean, I don't know. I think in the way Crowley looks at it, he's really talking about a person with a malformed ego. It's like a person with some magical abilities that just is like constantly just trying to enlarge the nephesh, the lowest part of the soul, the lowest part of the self.
Okay.
Right? It never gets out of the ego. It never gets more than the ego. I think that's his definition of a black brother.
One time I tried experimenting using the frameworks of black magic on ayahuasca.
Okay.
And me and Nicole and our friend Laird spent some time preparing ayahuasca over the course of several hours, during which we were chanting over it a mantra which was created by E.A. Coetting, which is Ram Ham Satolas. And Satolas in Coetting's system is supposed to be the ultimate darkness, right?
Okay.
And when we finally took it, the ayahuasca told Nicole, like, this is culturally appropriationist and racist. Like, this is not what we're doing. We're like, and basically, it said something similar to me, like, you're trying to arbitrarily put, like, a frame onto this, which has nothing to do with this. Ayahuasca is animated by its own consciousness, and it has its own purposes.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and our friend Laird did get thrown into some kind of dark red space, which was adverse and
adverse, to say the least.
Yes, and so he got maybe got a little bit more of what we were looking for, but you know, it was an interesting.
I love that there's an intervention from the drug itself, being like, just know this isn't what I do. In fact, just stop because I'm going to do something else.
Right. Yeah, right. But you know, I mean, that was done in the spirit of, you know. In Walter Kaufmann's book on Nietzsche, I don't know if Nietzsche uses this expression, but Walter Kaufmann talks about Nietzsche as being the philosopher of what if. So, you know, for an aphorism or for some extended period of writing, he'll entertain a notion.
Sure.
And it's kind of like a miniature philosophy as opposed to an entire system. And sometimes with these sorts of things, you know, I think playing the philosophy of what if is good, just as an exercise in self-discovery and experimentation. Connected with that is an idea quoted in the same text by Kaufmann. Kierkegaard has this great burn against Hegel, where he says that, you know, if Hegel had created the totality of his system, and then said after that, you know, that was just an experiment and one possible way of thinking, then he would be the greatest thinker ever. But as it is, he is merely comic.
Good Lord. Yeah. That's amazing.
But you can think about that as being a proto anticipation of chaos magic, because someone who creates a system and then says this is the system, and so it shall be for all, you know, is merely comic in that sense. But even if you do make a system and devote your whole life to it, and you still maintain a sense of the contingency of that system, then it's transparent to itself. In the sense of, and I mean that in the sense of, I think it's a phrase from Meister Eckhart, being a clear glass through which God can shine.
Wow. So,
and maybe you could connect that in a loose sense to being kind of self-luminous, you know.
Self-luminous?
Yeah, I mean that in a different sense than esoteric Buddhism is talking about luminosity.
Man, that's great. I mean, there's definitely something, it makes sense that an existentialist said that, because to me, you know, existentialism is kind of like being like, oh, there is an absence of those things that we really want there to be there, right? It's like the opposite of religion almost in a way.
Yeah.
And that's why it segues, because that's at the end of modernism, it segues so well into postmodernism, where everyone's like, right, there are no beliefs, haha, everything's crazy, which is where chaos magic comes into play. It's like the active magical version of that. You know, because you could also fall, it's where nihilism comes in too. And nihilism is when you're overcome by the lack of meaning, and it crushes you, and you're miserable.
Yeah.
And, you know, I would say chaos magic, for example, would be like something that is like a joyful celebration of the lack of meaning, or of your role as a co-creator in this void of meaning. And I think that, you know, it's also related to, as we were talking about Buddhism and realizing emptiness and the complete lack of substantiality of the world in which we find ourselves. It can be a joyous revelation in which the light shines through, the light of the sun, perhaps, or it can be a horrible hell where everything is just empty, Klephothic shells into which you drown.
You know,
up to you.
Yeah, well, you know, that's the whole thing with samsara being nirvana and nirvana being samsara.
Of course.
And I think that you could say the same thing about the cliff off and the tree of life.
Yes, absolutely.
as I was thinking in this vein, it occurred to me that there might be a lot of meaning in the fact that Da'af is the one sephira that conjoins the two frameworks, and particularly in the sense that life is said to be able to complexify best on the periphery between order and chaos.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that seemed like an especially meaningful thought to me. It's clarifying. Part of what motivated me to do the Lovecraft thing was sort of in tandem with it, was an exercise in the philosophy of what if that you could call physicalist mysticism.
Whoa.
Yeah, so those are two things that I think are generally regarded as being antonyms.
Of course.
Yeah. But, think of it this way. There is a line toward the end of Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus that says, not how the world is the mystical, but that the world is.
Nice.
Yeah. So I think that the world as it is understood by natural science, without adding anything to it, without embellishing it in any way, is still staggeringly mystical, because it arises for no purpose, and it is itself. It's, you know what I mean, in that sheer isness, and that sheer coming forth. And now, think about this. Andre Linde, who's a famous cosmologist, said the universe is an eternally growing, self-reproducing fractal. Okay? So, the universe emerges possibly from this singularity, right? And it is a fractal which is expressing itself for no reason, out of its own being. Mm-hmm. And that fractal gives rise to other fractals, ultimately complex of more and more densely knotted fractals until you have the nervous system. And Tegmark talks about how the universe is actually a mathematical object. Mm-hmm. The two ways you could kind of flesh that out. On the one hand, you could say that when we delve deep down into matter, we find that subatomic quantum particles don't seem to have what we intuitively think of as physical properties. They only have mathematical properties. So, in a sense, they're mathematical objects.
Yep.
Or think about this. You could define something as being a mathematical object if it is isomorphic with something else that you've already concluded is a mathematical object. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so is the universe isomorphic with the description of the universe? Yes. Is the description of the universe mathematical? Yes. Therefore, the universe is the mathematical object. Okay, so think about that. The universe is a pure web of relationality without qualia. It is purely formal relation, like extending infinitely. And if there are multiverses, like especially parallel multiverses of level 3 type, Wheeler Everett type thing, then the universe is this infinitely complex sort of omnifractal. And in the parts of it that are sufficiently complex as to allow for the expression of consciousness, there is qualia. So you could think of the mathematical universe as being existence, mm-hmm. and here we're imposing kind of arbitrary terminology, but philosophy does that sometimes. And the qualitative universe brought forth within the sphere of the nervous system as being, right? Okay. And so the universe is conscious in the sense that parts of it are conscious. Right. And the parts of it that are not rendered, and I like to say that luminosity could be translated into contemporary English as rendering.
That's very nice.
Then the universe is conscious in as much as we are. And because time is can be, some physicists disagree about this. I incline towards the view that time is illusory in the sense, because of things having to do with general relativity that I won't try to explain. But the universe is like a CD. Mm-hmm. The whole story of everything that will ever happen is on the disk outside of time, and consciousness plays the disk. And so in that sense, the universe always has been conscious and always will be conscious, even if every sentient being that ever will go extinct. Mm-hmm. And so you have this kind of mystical vision of being that is predicated in nothing other than the contents of natural science. nothing. So now I'm not saying that physicalist mysticism is, really the best position to take or the final position to take, but as a limit case to thought, to think that it's possible to still think the universe as being mystical without introducing any extra hypothesis about ontology, I think reveals something really cool.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's one of the first things I think about that too is like one of the kind of presuppositions of that point of view is that there are things outside of consciousness.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, the generally held view.
Right.
By almost everyone. But, yeah, I mean, it is a presupposition because if there is only qualia, there's only consciousness and its pieces.
You could make the argument, and someone who is not so philosophically inclined in the way that I'm defining philosophically inclined would say that this is kind of specious gerrymandering. But you could make the argument that the things outside of consciousness and the framework I'm suggesting aren't really things. They're just webs of abstract relations. Because unless they're rendered into qualia, they don't have being, they only have existence, and existence is just pure mathematical relationality.
Yeah. It's very hard to talk about that, though, because how does the mind say there is a thing that isn't a thing? It's like it's a thing the moment it goes into our thinking.
But maybe thinghood only comes forth when we have reification through conceptual imputation.
Sure.
And conceptual imputation is more than the linguistic imposition of a name. Conceptual imputation is the whole apparatus of our cognitive perceptual mechanisms being brought to bear to render the sensorium.
Of course.
So thinghood emerges out of this particular interaction.
Yeah. I just think, I guess it's maybe that's just like the kind of like my personal limit of being able to contemplate something like that, because I'm like, it's still in entering into consciousness, whatever that means, gains thingness, So like me talking about whether or not something exists objectively outside of consciousness is almost irrelevant because I can't go there. It's like that. Was it Shentong Rangtong almost in Tibetan Buddhism, right? It's like it's like this debate of whether or not there even is an external world at all.
Yeah.
Tough one.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think that actually, from a certain point of view, you could read what I was just saying as being kind of an argument for mind only as opposed to Madhyamaka, which is a little bit of a conceptual shift for me because I've always been leaning in a more Madhyamaka than Yogacara direction. But like you could say that the pure reality that Yogacara talks about, but Madhyamaka doesn't, could be that mathematical relational reality. Possibly. I don't know enough about the Yogacara to be able to say that definitively. But, and like I've been saying, part of what I see as the purpose of these dialogues is to kind of go ahead and hash out our half-baked ideas that we don't know if they even
I think
out.
We're certainly doing that.
Yeah. But I feel like if we do that together, we can kind of... Plato said, I feel like I've probably said this in most of the episodes that we've recorded, and it's probably good reason for that. Philosophy is only possible in dialogue. And in a sense, I think it's true that thinking is really an intrinsically social thing, that we are to the mind of humanity what neurons are to our mind, and we can only really do what we do if we're sending back and forth.
It sounds like very Socratic.
Yeah.
Love it.
Good times.
Speaking of time,
we've got another 10 minutes.
All right.
So what is God to you?
Oh, man, what? I claim apostasis.
I'm just being an asshole. Explain apostasis.
I mean, is that the word I mean? What's it? Oh, God. When you via negativa, that's what I'm claiming.
Okay, so God...
Just going to say the opposite of what God is.
Okay, so what's the
God
opposite?
isn't. God isn't
merely
really a man.
Okay, you know a really nice line that I like a lot from The Key by Whitley Strieber? what is absent within is God.
What?
Think about this, and here's a mindfuck, because I
Yep.
think you can connect this with the systems theoretic teleology that's articulated at the end of Ken Wilber's Sex, Ecology, Spirituality.
Okay.
He says that every holon, meaning everything that exists in the universe, is either incomplete or uncertain.
Okay.
And he says because of that, it has to kind of resolve its uncertainty by reaching a new completeness.
Totally.
And so the universe must evolve through iterating more and more systems. And this has to do sort of with the point of view that's attributed to Einstein. I don't know if he really said this or not, but he said no problem can be solved from within the level of consciousness that created it.
Yep, familiar.
So that goes for the evolving cycle of the universe as it evolves life and minds and cultures. And they just keep introducing new contradictions, which have to be resolved by more evolution. And that has to continue forever. But it's always trying to overcome a lack. And you can think of that lack as dukkha, as suffering, as incompleteness.
Of course.
And so the effort to resolve that lack creates God. And so I think that if you line this up with Plotinus, with Hegel, you could see a sense of God creating itself and the kind of the animating power behind that being lack.
Man, I love this. Yeah, this is great. I mean, that totally makes sense. It's especially like a lot of times dukkha is translated as unsatisfactoriness.
Yes.
You know, because like the satisfaction would be like that ultimate coming together that these impartial things, these partial things desire, but which do not have.
Yeah.
I read a cool quote from Adi Da the other day. I really like Adi Da, despite being a total fucking controversial fucker.
Yeah.
And this is a paraphrase because I didn't memorize it, but he was like, there are so many someplace else's which are desirable.
Yes.
But why do you seek these someplace else's when you cannot, expecting you can be blissful there when you cannot even be blissful where you are?
Yeah.
Yeah. I probably have more commentary on that, but let's let that sit with you for a second.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I personally am constantly trying to resolve problems and gain things and make these connections between my holons and my issues and make my career work. And I think that I will be so much happier when I do. But it's part of me knows that that's just a rat race.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that in my mind is kind of connected with the hypothetical framework I put forward as physicalist mysticism is the idea that Parmenides and Heraclitus are both simultaneously true. Parmenides being the point of view that change is illusory. There is only one changeless eternal reality.
Yeah.
Right. And Heraclitus being best known for the idea that change is the only thing that's real.
Yeah.
I think that it's possible to create an ontology that navigates a middle path between them.
Yeah, they're talking about the same thing. They're different perspectives of the same thing.
Yeah. And I think then that there is completeness in the eternal. And and that brings it back to Wittgenstein, because at the end of the Tractatus, where it gets all mystical, he says, if you understand by eternity not infinite duration but timelessness, then I can't quote it exactly, but you can find it right now.
Wow, he says that? That's great.
Yeah, he says it. There's a
wow, that is just wow. Sometimes I read these sentences or hear them, and I'm like, that's just so clear. I went through so much to get a taste of this, and now that guy is saying it so nicely.
It's like a fucking Zen thing, the Tractatus. But he even says those who have understood my propositions and have climbed over them and through them can throw them away like a ladder. And that's just like in Buddhism when they say you can discard the raft.
That's so great.
Yeah, there's a recording of fucking Alan Watts reading some of the last last page or two of that. And I think if wasn't given context, one could be forgiven for thinking that it's a Zen discourse.
Yeah, that's great. I tried to read just the end of that once, but I was like, this whole thing is built on aphorisms that add up to this. It makes no sense for me to just jump in somewhere.
Yeah, it's a challenging text, and it's very rooted in the very specific philosophical agenda of the people that Wittgenstein was studying under.
Yeah, sure.
And the technical problems that they're working on. You know, I think that with nonfiction, it's not always cheating to read the end first. And I think that it has a certain value, even independent of the rest of it.
Yeah. I mean, that quote is so great because, of course, like if you're living in a reality which is time and space based, as we are, 4-dimensional, 3-dimensional, whatever, 4-dimensional, conventionally held, I think. Then, of course, that you use the bounds of this, of your body logic, of spatial logic, to try to understand all concepts. It becomes the kind of baseline in your head. And even they talk about like basic space, even in Vajrayana.
Yeah.
But, so of course, then one could, I guess, be forgiven for thinking, as he said in that one, like, if you think of eternal, that they would first think of eternal as a limitless amount of time.
Yes.
In terms of time. But if eternal doesn't define itself by time, it's external to it. So if you are, from that perspective, you're not looking at time, which is now just going on forever. It's just not even there at all.
Indeed.
An eternal moment, you could say.
Yeah. So we're coming down to the end of the hour, and maybe I'll close with this fun little anecdote. Wittgenstein himself believed that mysticism and ethics were really the only things that matter, or the most important things.
Wow.
But that philosophy, that language, couldn't get to them. That's why it ends with the expression, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. But, you know, Wittgenstein wound up inspiring the logical positivists who basically said, you know, fuck mysticism, fuck spirituality, fuck religion, it's all meaningless. And here's something I learned today as I was reading Dean Radin's book, Real Magic.
Nice.
A.J. Ayer, one of the real heavy hitters of logical positivism, actually had a near-death experience at the age of 77. And what happened was he experienced trying to cross a shore again and again and not being able to do so. And he saw this red light, which was incredibly bright and incredibly painful, and which was responsible for governing the universe. And when he came back, he said, you know, that didn't make me believe in God, but it made it a lot harder for me to believe that death would be the end. And that was fucking A.J. Ayer.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. Fuck,
God
right?
bless that man.
Yeah, indeed. So,
Or whoever.
This has been another episode of
Ontological Shock.
where we talk about weird shit. And my name is Nathaniel Voss.
I'm Seth.
And we'll see you again next time.